Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. A real pleasure to see old friends and some new faces. My time frame today, when I get to the mundane, will be the 30s to the 70s. The basis is really a lot of archival research that I've been doing over the last 10, 15 years, some interviews that I did in the 80s and 90s. It's a chance, it's a funny thing to be retired and looking back. It's a chance to redo things I did before on the basis of networks and interviews and this and that. Now I go look at the archive. And my basic line is, now I can understand what was going on while we were all too busy to notice. Other things that were happening. So it's kind of a do-over. If I go too fast or leave something out, it's mostly there in the following places. I have a website, whorulеsamerica.net, and I have a couple docs on there. One is that I put up in the last year or so. One is on the history of labor. One is on the history of Social Security Act. Lots of archival, juicy kinds of commentary in those. My 2011 book, co-authored, is called Class and Power and the New Deal, and Martine kindly mentioned my 2013 book. I also have an article coming out next month in a relatively new online journal called Class, Race, and Corporate Power, which I like for its title, which kind of summarizes everything I've worked on over the last 50 years, a lot of my doing in that title. Well, the main actors in my talk today are the corporate rich, a phrase Mills used for a reorganized property class. It's the owners and managers of large income-producing properties. Corporate rich really have three parts to them that we'll come across in this talk. One are a set of people I call moderate conservatives, and they have a number of organizations they worked through. One of them I will talk about maybe briefly, called the Committee for Economic Development, who archivally I've also been into. And they're really fascinating because they publish their policy views and criticisms of those views by some of their members. So you go back and look through those and then supplement that with archives. There's also very ultra-conservative members of the corporate rich. We know them as the National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and so on. And finally, I'll talk about the Southern rich, but literally meant plantation capitalists, who are very important in all this, and their views are somewhat different on some things than these other two. However, they all do share one thing: they're totally opposed to unions, and their whole goal in life is to control labor markets. That's more important to them even, I believe, than profits. Power is more important than profits. But then I'm a political sociologist, and I believe that economics is the handmaiden of political sociology. On the other side of the divide, there's a liberal labor coalition that developed in the 1930s. Well, why did this corporate rich, I'm going to claim, defeat the Lib Lab coalition so completely? First of all, there's a big picture. Ain't got nothing to do with the 30s to the 70s. It's very important to understand, think of Europe, that there's no power rivals to business in the United States, unlike in various European countries. There's no landed aristocrat. There's no big state elite. You had to have a pretty organized state, or you didn't exist anymore. In other words, that's how we end up with France and Germany. You start out with hundreds of states, and the ones that were able to put it together and join with military force are the ones we know to exist. And of course, we had no big military historically. And I would add this: no big church, no big Catholic church, no church that in 1890 says, hey, we think that workers should have unions, and hence no Christian Democrats who are, come out of this Catholic kind of tradition. I'm going very fast, I realize, but it's important to understand they didn't have these power rivals. And that meant that when business got bigger and they were aimed at these workers who were now asking to unionize, they had an absolute straight shot at them, an absolute straight shot. And the contrast that's important here, and perhaps in many ways best developed by Kim Voss in Sociology on this campus, is that if you compare the development of the American labor movement with the two or three countries she looked at in Europe, they were going along about the same. But when the capitalists said it's time to wham bam on these workers, these rival elites in these other countries say, hey, we ain't going to let you do that. And in this country, there's nobody to say that. And so there's a different development of unions in the United States and various European countries. So that gives us a kind of a background, of a big picture background. But there's two other factors about America that help the corporate rich to win as well. In other words, they're built-in features of the system that really help them greatly. And these two features interact. And the first is that because we have a presidential system and because we have a single-member district plurality system for electing people to the Senate and the House, this has a strong push to a two-party system. A vote for a third party to the left is a vote for your worst enemy. A vote for the third party to the right is a vote for your worst enemy. The Libertarians, incidentally, have cost the Republicans maybe 4 or 5 Senate seats in the last 10 years, and they did cost them the governorship of Wisconsin at one point. So it matters big time, and it means then that if you start a party to the left or to the right, your closest allies will hate you. And I want to use the word hate because I want to remind you back to Ralph Nader in 2000. Because the feminists, the civil rights movement, and so on, did not forgive him for costing them that election. And we can say, oh, Gore wasn't a very good candidate and blah, blah. But the fact is that he won enough votes in New Hampshire and Florida that the other side won. And from the point of view of the liberals, that was a big problem. And to say, oh, well, you could have gone out and won the center or something, it's easier said than done. So this single-member district means two parties. But it interacts powerfully with another variable. It's historical, and that's the North-South split, which means two different political economies. One producing agricultural products for a world market with first slave and then Jim Crow labor. Very different from the North. And in that context, because once they settled some of their key differences in the Constitution, they still had differences, meaning the well-to-do, the rich, the owners. And the Northerners eventually had what we call a Republican Party, yes, first the Federalists and so on. But the Southern rich from the start had the Democrats and their friends in the North, who were basically outsiders in the North. They were ethnic rich, like Irish at the first, but they were also Unitarians and so on and so forth. And I would submit to you today that the Democratic Party is still the outgroup in America, in its voting and in the people who give it money. They are people that are in various ways excluded by the Anglo-Saxon Protestants, da-da-da, Christians, Catholics, etc. Those white people exclude these other people, including some white people who are Jewish or Muslim or whatever it may be. So you have to understand that the Democratic Party was the party of the Southern rich. And what that means is there was nowhere for a lib-lab coalition to go when it did form in the 1930s. And so they had to make a bargain and stay in that Democratic Party. But it was a difficult bargain. In places I've called it a sordid bargain because you got to just look the other way on straight-out racism, which is going to matter when we come to the 1960s. Now, in the Congress itself, because of the complexity of our country, the Democratic Party sometimes does things that the Northern rich do not like, and sometimes it does things or wants to do things that the Southern rich do not like. And the answer to that is what's called the conservative voting coalition, when a majority of Southern Democrats vote with a majority of Northern or non-Southern Republicans. And that coalition comes together and wins whenever there's a labor issue, a union issue, a regulation of business kind of issue. On the other hand, it does not form on certain key spending kinds of issues. So really Congress is a conservative coalition, which is a class coalition, and a spending coalition, which is broader, which includes the southern rich looking for their subsidies, urban developers looking for their subsidies, the unions, which are glad to be in with the developers and the construction unions. They want subsidies from the big government, and it's where the liberals can go too, because they, as part of being part of this coalition, can deliver for lower income workers and sometimes improve kinds of welfare. Okay, let's look now at this Lib-Lab coalition, which did develop in the 30s, and I'll come to that. But what has it got? What helps? Why is Lib-Lab not totally creamed, given what I have said? And the answer is big social upheavals. That's the answer. And what does that mean specifically? The Great Depression, which is when there was the organization of the union movement, as we'll see. World War II, another big advance for the union movement. The Korean War, as you'll see, matters. And the Vietnam War also mattered in a big-time way. And if we look at all of that and say, okay, let's remember 1964. Despite all the things I've said the corporate rich have going, and despite all these wars and depressions and so on, or because of them in good part, look at 1964, big victory for LBJ. The conservative coalition was at a minimum in terms of the number of votes it had in that Congress after that 64 election. It was the high point since 1935 for the Democrats, for liberal and for labor. We got Medicare, got big grants to education, diversion of funds into a war on poverty, and so on. Now, this liberal labor coalition, though, and we're going to see this in detail, also has enormous handicaps. It has divisions. It's always had divisions. It's always been exclusionary. Workers face one of two choices. One choice, they can do one of two things. If they can make themselves rare, then they're more valuable. In other words, tight labor market's what they want. And so the AFL's number one goal when it formed in 1886 was to stop immigration. But make them more valuable. And so there's then divisions. But in came immigrants anyhow, and these immigrants were from Eastern Europe, they were from Southern Europe, they were Catholic, they were Jewish, and that adds an ethnic layer because the skilled Republican with the fancier meaning workers were these from the British Isles and Northern Europe. And they were skilled workers. So you got a skilled, unskilled kind of split. But the biggest problem, of course, of all, was the way in which all white Americans, immigrant or not, treated African Americans. In other words, the key final tipping point in my account today is white racism. The point is that there were just enough white Americans, middle Americans, as Nixon called them, not a bad term, turned to vote for Republicans to put Republicans in office. And that made the difference. When Republicans won the presidency in '68, the conservative coalition was revived, the troubles really cascaded from that particular point. And thus the rise and fall of union density and the fall and rise of inequality, which you see on that graphic. So, my graphic is mostly just an outcome variable. It's just a prop in the sense that if you look at that and want to explain the ups and downs that you see on there, I think they're explained by the variables I've just named, but we're also going to see that right now in a historical kind of sequence. Namely, we're going to see when there's a rise in union density and when there's a decline, and we're going to see that the inequality Gini coefficient does precisely the opposite. And the correlation between those two little graphics, one is a Gini for urban male workers, which is the closest stand-in I could find for union. Urban male workers is the one, and the other is union density, and the one that goes back furthest as far as the time series involves, and that means non-agricultural labor. But it correlates pretty close. It's pretty similar to the other measures of union density. I know there's a lot of other intervening variables, or whatever you call them, that I'm now going to talk about, but the point is the correlation between those two time series is minus 0.94. Minus 0.94. Well, I also put C. Wright Mills on there on that graphic. After Mills wrote The Power Elite, and he was severely criticized by liberals, by Marxists, by this, by that, by academics, he wrote an answer. And his answer was, he says, I think a lot of people are judging this on the basis of whether they find it optimistic enough or hopeful enough or not. And then he made the quote that I have. He said wrote the thing that I printed. He said, first you try to get it straight. I think that's my goal, is to try to get it straight. And then we try to judge it. A lot of things that I say go against my hope, my predilections, and so on, and they certainly go against the predilections of those that hold to big theories that say how history is going to unfold. And so I want to make clear that I recognize some people won't like this story. The small aside would be when I asked numerous friends, I didn't know it was going to be such a great Rorschach test, but I said, what do you think of calling the version of Who Rules America the Triumph of the Corporate Rich? And several people said, you got to go with what you think the situation is. And others say, you can't do that. It spreads despair. Spreads hope, lack of hope, which I had first been accused of when I spoke at Stanford to what was supposed to be a giant audience, but this was about 70, but lo and behold, there was nobody there. And afterwards, the Maoists really came up and criticized me for my views. But in any case, I'm trying to get it straight. What's the story? How does the story begin? How do I slap all that together? We start with this tremendous depression. It really did mess up all of northern and southern rich. First people that got relief were the southern rich through something called the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was put forth by corporate moderates. Southern plantation guys really loved it, and what it does, it gives money to these big plantation owners in exchange for not growing crops. So it propped them up. It was a straight subsidy. It was a bailout, if we call it today, and it was pretty big. I've compared it roughly with the recent bailout. But it also had another consequence. It was a huge enclosure movement. Lots of everyday workers were then forced off the land, forced into the cities, and that was in a large part African Americans. So it was start of a major dislocation, plus northern movement and so on and so forth in a bigger way than during World War I, and that's going to matter in this particular story. Well, the AAA passed pretty fast, and even though Roosevelt wanted to say, hey, I think we can cool it for now, some business guy said, no, let's go for it. It was called the NRA, and this was going to regulate business. It was going to put a minimum wage. They were going to control prices a little bit. They were also going to control amount of output. And so they wanted this National Recovery Act. But there was one thing to get everybody on board. This shows labor had just enough power. There was a little clause in there called 7A. And 7A said unions have the right to organize. How in the world could that get into this legislation and into later, more important legislation for labor? Well, first of all, there was a little bit of a liberal labor coalition that was for it, and labor really pushed for it. But the key thing was that the liberals, like Senator Wagner, went to the Southern Democrats and said, will you go for this if we leave out your workforce? And the Southerners said, of course we'll go for it under those conditions. So the NRA passed. The ultra-conservatives in the North didn't like it at all. They didn't like 7A. They saw it. The corporate moderates thought they could handle it. No sweat. We've got our little employee representation plans called company unions and so on, and they'd studied it scientifically, and they had social scientists studying human relations and industrial relations. What happened, though, was unexpected, and that was you got a huge upheaval. Piven and Cloward write about this very well. An NRA was then seen as an opening by labor. And in fact, there's a famous statement, John L. Lewis of the miners, he'd have his people go around, and they'd say, the president wants you to join a union. After all, President Roosevelt had signed it. But people would say, it wasn't clear whether they meant Lewis or Roosevelt. But either way, the president wants you to join a union. And so, wow, it's happening. Now, the NRA had a labor advisory board and industrial advisory board. That means the biggest wheels in the country at that time. And so the head of Standard Oil in New Jersey calls the labor guys and he says, let's talk. We got to talk, the big union guy. And they have a meeting. It's been written about. And the head of Standard Oil actually said, let's have a little truce, he even used that word, to get the economy going again. And then we'll talk about this stuff. So now they have an argument, which has been chronicled. And some of the labor guys said, yeah, we'll do that if you say you recognize our right to unionize. Other business guys wouldn't say that. But they come to, long story, got to be short, and that is that they agree that they're going to create a national labor board. It's on a model of what was going on in World War I, in which the big business guys and labor guys are going to sit there, the tribunal, decide how these strikes are going to be decided, how it's going to be adjudicated. So these big deals sit on this board together. And they do hear a lot of cases, and they're all about real small-time stuff, real small businesses. And they're doing all right. They settle them, and there's actually some unions that are created and so on. But the ultra-conservatives would not go for it. The big steel, big this and that and the other thing. But steel was the best example. Big autos hated it, too. And so that basically sank this labor board. But the liberals now met, led by this man, Senator Wagner, and they developed a different plan. Let's put some teeth, basically, into this labor board. Well, the big business guys, and this is where my archival research comes in, I found new stuff. And nobody's seen it before. It's a lay-down hand. I want to just, humbly, immodestly say it's a lay-down hand if you take the risk of looking at it, which no historian or rival sociologist, I have critics, has bothered to do. But in any case, what happened was then that they tried to oppose this, and they failed. Now, they didn't fail the first time, and that's important. That was in 1934. They did not fail. They scuttled the act, and there's archival stuff where it said, I think that labor just gave us their best shot. We're not going to have to worry about this again. But the 1934 elections elected a huge amount of Democrats. And they were back at it again in 1935, and the National Labor Relations Act passed over the overwhelming, total, complete opposition of all business people. Why did it pass? It passed partly because liberal labor was now a coalition. This is where they really formed, 33, 34, 35. They passed it. But once again, the Southerners acquiesced. That's why we got the National Labor Relations Act. We also got the Social Security Act under the same alliance. But here I want to tell you flat out, where I've got even better evidence, that the corporate guys created the Social Security Act. They wrote it. They wrote it. W-R-O-T-E, wrote it. And nobody believes that, of course, but they haven't looked at the evidence. In any case, that all was, the business guys immediately started to put together their goon squads and constitutional challenges and so on and so forth. Nothing quite happened, really, though, because the labor guys had to settle some arguments among themselves, which they sort of failed on, but sort of settled. And they had to make sure Roosevelt was reelected. Once that happened, and it was a huge success, the Democrats really won even bigger in 1936. Liberal labor is on the march. And there's a huge union upsurge in 1938, and 1937, and 1938. It basically goes from 3 million to 9 million people in unions, roughly. Big surge. What happened? It went backwards. Why? First of all, I think most importantly, when the CIO, which was the Integrated Industrial Union, went south, they were going to create racially integrated unions. And they were using sit-down strikes, which are a tremendously potent weapon, which of course got outlawed pretty damn quickly. But at that point, mixed with some other things, namely the court packing, which the Southerners saw as a way to put liberals on the Supreme Court and challenge racial dominance in the South pulled out of the deal. And from that was the start of the downward march. From that day on, the Southern Democrats were unalterably opposed every minute of the day to unions. And that has to be understood. Now, they immediately got into alliance with the ultra-conservative corporate guys in the North and the AFL, which was losing to the CIO. So the three of them essentially create what becomes the Taft-Hartley Act in 1948. We have archival evidence of this. James A. Gross, who has written 3 volumes on organized labor through the eyes of the National Labor Relations Act. Think about whether you've read James Gross or whether you've ever seen him cited. And he's a very respectable, proper guy at the Labor Industrial Relations School at Cornell. In any case, they were ready to do in the National Labor Relations Board 3940. Union density is going down a little bit. World War II saved the union movement from stasis. Strong statement. I don't have much time. And there was a recession in 1938. Roosevelt didn't believe his Keynesians. They balanced the budget. They did other things. Everything they did went against Keynes and was like a giant experiment. And the economy just nosedived again. And in the 38 election, they lost. Democrats lost pretty big in the North and in the 38 election. And so the conservative coalition was revived. There were now enough Northern Republicans to join with these Southern Democrats who had turned against the New Deal. And that, in one way, as you say, that's all she wrote. This goes down from this point onward. But World War II saved the union movement. You don't fight 2 major powers and have to rearm and be fighting the working class of your country. And so there was a standstill agreement. There was a new one of these labor boards that had business, labor, and the public on it, and they essentially replaced the old labor board for the duration of the war. And the unions went from 9 million to 15 million and hit their highest density, which you see on that thing in 1945. But there's something else that was going on at this time, and that is that this was an opportunity for an opening for African Americans, who did play a role in the reconversion, industrialization, and also had some important roles in World War II, including fighting in key battles like the Battle of the Bulge, where they kept the African Americans behind the lines, but all of a sudden the Germans surged on them, and they had to put the African Americans into the fighting, which they didn't want to do. And I think it's needs to be studied about human beings. If I've fought and died for a country, my attitude changes. And indeed, that was one of the key things. Now we have an African American population that's in cities, including northern cities, has a base, and a lot of people that came back had a whole changed attitude about how things were going to be. But post-World War II, the unions lost. Again, they went down. Taft-Hartley Act was tough on unions. It did cut out lots of opportunities of picketing. So power-wise, post-World War II was bad. And by 1950, using the cautious kinds of economics and so on, lo and behold, unemployment was actually 9-10%, just starting down. And all of a sudden, and I think it was a total coincidence and accident, there's a Korean War. And the Korean War comes as a shock. They get pushed around. They actually get just about pushed right off the peninsula. There's controls then, again, on prices. Big business comes to run the whole defense effort again. And there's very low unemployment. the lowest unemployment we've ever had since World War II. It was down to 2.8, 2.9, 3, 3.1. This was 50, 51, 52, 53. So the Korean War revived the union movement. Post-Korean War, what happened? Down on density, up on inequality. The passage of another act that limited labor called Landrum-Griffin. Key thing was it further limited picketing, basically turned picketing from a potentially kick-ass stop work thing into symbolic kind of act. And that's different than when you can stop goods from being delivered or things being made or shoppers from shopping and so on. So things were going down, and then we have the 60s. We've all heard about the 60s. And there were two parts. One, of course, was the civil rights movement, which in many ways is the culmination of all that's gone before in terms of the out-migration from the South, in terms of a contribution to World War II and an urbanization. But also there's another part that you must understand, which you won't like, and that is you must understand that the New Deal coalition was built on the exclusion of African Americans from the goodies, period. That's got to be understood. It's hard to believe. But in fact, what it did, because the Northerners had to look the other way on the Southern Jim Crow system to keep this alliance, because you needed those Southern white voters, don't you? Do you believe me? Of course you do, because they're all Republicans now. If we'd known then, we might have said, woo, yeah, this is going to be... LBJ knew incidentally. He said, we can kiss the South goodbye for a couple of generations, he said, when he signed the Civil Rights Act. African Americans had no choice because they were trapped in this thing. There was no thing to do but what I would call dynamite the power structure, and it did dynamite the American power structure. The unions were just as atrocious as the South. Seen best in, I think, Kevin Boyle's book on the UAW and the Promise of American Liberalism, where he beautifully uses UAW files to show how totally racist the rank and file was, even with this very liberal leadership, of course. And, of course, Ruther understood the powder keg that he was sitting on. No unions, no skilled workers, hardly any African Americans among the skilled workers in those unions and so on. So African Americans dynamited that particular power arrangement. And that's a very important part of the 60s and the disruption in the city. But the really important point then next is the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War is important because it again generated unemployment. Good times rolled in the late 60s. There had not been much decline in unemployment till 65, 66. And so now all of a sudden you've got lots of people overseas, and you're building weapons again of various kind, and you're spending. And you can't cut the spending that you have in terms of trying to ameliorate the crisis and disruption in the city. Now, the amount of money in the cities that was spent in the war on poverty can be overstated. And political scientists that some of us know well from Santa Cruz, Michael K. Brown wrote on this in an extremely persuasive fashion in his book on race, money, and American politics in 1999. And so we have this situation in the late 60s then of all this disruption in the cities. We have this tight labor market. We have inflation. Now, this is then a major problem for the economics. And here it gets more complicated, and I'm only going to touch on parts of it, the complication being the international part of the situation. But for now, I just want to say that you got to understand that then the key votes, in 66, the conservatives came back. Well, the party that's out, often comes back in the off-year election. But they were getting more votes in the South. The Republicans are cracking the, quote, solid South. In 68, it all came home. The white vote usually moved over to away from the Democrats. They either voted for the racist, open racist George Wallace, or they voted for Nixon. So Democrats went from 60% of the vote to basically 40% of the vote, and lost to Nixon like 42 to 41 or some close number, with George Wallace getting other votes, including 7-8% in Ohio and Indiana and so on and so forth. So this is serious evidence of this kind of racial split. And here I should double back one way. I made 64 sound all peachy keen, but in fact, in those primaries, George Wallace won a lot of votes in the North. He won big time in those at Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and in the state of Maryland. A lot of places. But what happened was in 64, the white workers still voted their pocketbooks. In 68, they voted their skin color. They did not vote anti-Vietnam, I would argue to you as an aside, because, in fact, they were very much opposed to the war in many ways, too. It was race, and they voted their skin color. They did not want integrated neighborhoods, integrated schools, integrated unions, or integrated workforce. And that was the all she wrote. Because at that particular point, when the Republicans come in, they are then able to use the Department of Labor and change the National Labor Relations Board in such a way that they totally undercut the construction unions first, and then later other unions as well. And on reverse key rulings that were made in the 60s that I won't have time to talk about unless they come up in question, that actually the Kennedy Board had made some liberal decisions that I must confess as a 60s person, we didn't notice. We were too busy looking at all other things. And in fact, the business guys, and this is where my own archival research has come in, they were livid by 62 or 63 about the NLRB, it's called, the Labor Board. They were livid, and they were organizing to change the law. And they very fancy, all the things we now hear, oh God, they got all this money. They had it all then, they were just as organized. They did not win a damn thing until the Republicans got in. That's the important point. Until the conservative coalition got stronger. And that then made it possible to start to do in the unions. The problem was that LBJ did not want to put on the kind of controls that had been used during the Korean and the war in World War II. He tried to finesse that, but at the same time he wanted to continue spending on ameliorating things in the cities. But the Southern Democrats would not let him. The Southern Democrats, the conservative coalition, tried to force a decision in terms of spending in the cities, because they wanted to do law and order, not ameliorative kind of spending. Furthermore, the Southerners would not let LBJ and the corporate moderates do the Keynesian thing. They all knew what to do, which was that you then raise taxes. And especially you should raise taxes in that situation on the well-to-do, which was out of the question, so they were just going to raise taxes on everybody. But there's a liberal Keynesian way to do these things that got wiped out, and these people called, that I call moderate conservatives, had a conservative Keynesianism that worked. But the point is, Southerners wouldn't let them pass that tax hike, and they could have made some other. They could have cut spending on themselves. In fact, these corporate moderates I studied, when their policy statements of 68 to 69 are so fascinating, because they said, if necessary, we got to cut agricultural subsidies. We got to cut this. We got to cut that. In other words, they're going to cut themselves. They're going to have to cut their subsidies. They weren't going to go for that. Not the Southerners and not the ultra-conservatives. And so the system is now out of whack. It's got spiraling inflation, which doesn't really hurt people, ordinary people, that much, because the good times are rolling. There's lots of money out there and so on. Jobs for professors everywhere. Drop out of school and be a radical, you can still get a job. There's millions of professor jobs, which disappeared in 5 or 10 years. So that was the key. Now I'll get to the sort of the complicated part. that I don't think is fully understood or appreciated, and something I've only really started to work on and be concerned with. In dealing with inflation and with their various other problems, the Republicans were trapped. The corporate moderates, Nixon, who was very much had their views, he had all those people, those kind of people in his administration. They were trapped by the fact that they still were trying to rebuild Europe. They wanted strengthened capitalist classes in Japan and Europe. They were still worried about the Soviet Union. Now, what does that translate into is that they were in a fix where they're exporting their inflation to Europe and to the world as a whole. They're just ripping inflation through. And these other countries are saying, you got to cool it, or we're going to make you cool it because we're going to ask you to give us gold in exchange for your dollars. Now, this was a key thing about propping up these other economies that I don't want to try to get into. But you can understand it just if I say, I can constrain the American economy. If I take my dollars, I'm a French person, that it was actually the British that did them worse, we thought it was the French, and I want to turn these dollars into gold. You got to give me your gold. Well, America was running out of gold. But why did it stay on it? It stayed on it in terms of these world issues. What's the problem at home is they couldn't deal with labor fully while trying to deal with basically the empire or fighting the Cold War. They were kind of screwed. And they knew it. And they knew it in the late 60s. And when Nixon came in and he put these corporate moderates in Treasury, he said, okay, what should we do, guys? And they said, hold on as long as you can for these geopolitical reasons, but when the time comes, don't negotiate about the value of the dollar and, a dollar exchange. Close the gold window, it's called. That is, say, brothers, you're all on your own. Your currency is floating. He finally did that. He did that in, I guess it was 71. He put on wage price controls and he floated the dollar. He won't take your gold no more. And this just ripped through these other countries in ways that we shouldn't try to get into, because now their exchange rates just went all over the place. But it strengthened America. So here we are saying, oh boy, they're in real trouble. The economy's about to die. Nixon's move totally empowered him and the corporations, because now they could fight unions at home and they could continue to expand overseas and fight the Soviets and help these other countries to fully recover. Don't forget that at that point they were still thinking World War II mentality. They wanted these Europe and Japan recovered. Now, so this set them loose then. Now they can really take on the unions. But something else happened in the 70s that we don't fully appreciate, especially when we say, oh, the Keynesian economy, Keynesian economics failed and so on. I want to start by saying, you think of the 70s, you think of this unbroken inflation and so on. If I had my little inflation thing on there too, you'd see that actually they got control of inflation by late 72. It was down in a reasonable kind of way through these various measures that they had taken. Here's what happened that's so important. There were 3 external shocks to the system that could not be handled while at the same time fighting labor. Now, what is that going to mean? First of all, there were agricultural shortages that developed around the world. And those agricultural shortages also hit America because Nixon, for geopolitical reasons, had sold a whole lot of wheat to the Soviet Union. Again, part of the Cold War, trying to get some buddies, the fancy maneuvers of foreign policy. And so there were various kinds of shortages, and actually there were new leftist people that I then later came to know, like the future mayor of Santa Monica, Ruth Yanata Goldway. They got involved in these, we won't buy meat, we're going to do this. In other words, there were all these food kind of strikes and so on, not buying. over these high prices. Furthermore, many natural resources came up short. This is just a fickle finger of how things work. It wasn't manipulated, nothing. It's just the world and how it's chaotic. But the third one was a real wacko schmacko, and that was the oil embargo, which really socked the American economy something fierce, and other economies as well, and sent shock waves. Now, what does that create? It creates what is now called, from 75 on, actually before that, it's a cost-push inflation. There's an outside force. It's not demand. It's this outside force that's creating a inflation. And what that does is it drains consumer pockets. That is, you have to pay more for ag, you have to pay more for oil, you're standing in a gas line, et cetera, et cetera. That's taking a lot of money from you and going to Arab countries in this case, and Iran, oil countries, that's out of the American consumer. Plus, because there's now this inflation, it really took off, then you're in a higher tax bracket. So you were now taxed much higher. So there's this tremendous drain on the American economy. But what was needed at that point was demand. You had to have consumer demand. And you had to, especially maybe lower the taxes of people with lower incomes. And you had to have government spending. At this point, the corporate moderates said, screw you. We don't want to listen to you no more, even though we have you for our advisors up till now, because we're going to use high interest rates. Now, what do high interest rates do? They throw people out of work. They create unemployment. And that was their preference over paying higher taxes themselves or continuing to grow various kinds of social programs. And they essentially retreated to two social programs that subsidize them. One are food stamps, which subsidizes agribusiness, and the other, of course, is the Earned Income Tax Credit, which you've probably just read in newspapers. Big study, maybe at Berkeley, right? Oh, where did I read it? Anyway, what was it at Berkeley? So here's this study saying, hey, you know what? This Earned Income Tax Credit subsidizes the McDonald's of the world. But we all knew that. So sure, those were the two solutions they were for. And there's four now. And still are. They love them. So we're in this situation where it should not be high interest rates, but high interest rates are a power issue at this point. And nothing damn do, in my opinion, with economics. And so at that point, they said, we're not Keynesians anymore, because Nixon had even said he was a Keynesian. Their version, which I haven't been able to get into the differences, time, but the point is then, they said, no, we're deserting that. We're really monetarists. We love the Chicago school. Now, if you read it from an academic point of view, they said, oh, those Chicago economists, they had these brilliant arguments, and the Keynesians couldn't figure out what's going on. And that's why the monetarists became so important. I don't believe it at all. I believe that the corporate moderates switched their views, deserted their mild Keynesianism because they wanted to use high interest rates that further discipline the American workforce. And that was the start of the triumph of the corporate rich. The Carter years, which I'm not going to say anything more about, were the absolute triumph in every way, on every issue. Tax cuts, defeat of union reform, on and on. Humphrey Hawkins Act, all of them got shredded during the Carter years. And I think you'll find a wide range of people saying it. People that I disagree with profoundly. We agree that the Carter years were the triumph of the big business. So that's how the corporate rich triumphed. They did triumph completely. You see that in the rest of the graph. They go up, unions go down. And they did it because of these background variables they had in their favor and the white racism that took just enough voters into the Republican Party to finish off the Democrats. Thank you very much.